Let me put this here. I'm called the meeting to order. All right, y'all, welcome to the Justice and Public Safety meeting for April 30th, 2025. First order of business is I need a motion to approve the minutes for February 19th, Justice and Public Safety meeting.
Motion to approve. Second.
All approved?
Aye.
Aye. Motion approved. All right, tonight we're gonna have Sheriff Breeden to discuss the Sheriff's Department ordinances that need to be amended and are created on the extended stay in hotels, camping on private property, and authorize the address of derelict structures.
Sheriff, you guys can come up here if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah, come on up.
Just make sure that camera's turned right to you so everybody can see you and hear you.
Which camera? All
Just stand right, just squat down right
There
there.
you
Okay,
go.
that's exactly what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, there you go.
One of the things that we wanted to address was the long-term stays in hotels shall not be places of residence. One of the things that we have seen in hotels where a lot of crime and high crime are hotels that allow people to essentially live at the hotel. And when Lieutenant Wooten and I did the trips up on Carowinds Boulevard, and we went to the Motel 6, for example, they had one, I guess you'd call them a tenant. They had been there for over 273 days, and another one had been there over 700 days, so almost 2 years at the hotel. And so they went to all the hotels up there. This leads to derelict vehicles in the parking lot. They went back up and followed up with them to get a lot of those towed this week. And so we were trying to get a length of stay per occupant at the hotels, but one of the things that when people have done these, there's been loopholes that says you have to just check in and check out every 30 days, which then all somebody's got to do is technically go down to the lobby and say, I'm checking out, and check back in. They never leave.
Right.
So we were trying to say that you had to leave the hotel for 72 hours, then check back in. Because what that'll do is it'll prevent you from doing it. You're not going to live there,
Right.
get everything gathered up and leave. And then what it'll also do is not allow the hotels to allow somebody to become a permanent resident, because after 30 days they have to vacate the hotel. Now there would be exceptions to it. Your house burned down, there were national emergencies, you know, we had hurricane people, or you know, somebody might be here for a shutdown at Duke Power.
Yeah,
or
I was gonna ask work.
And those type things would be the exceptions in it.
Okay.
And so that was this length of stay at hotels was a major thing, because what that does is it gets your long-term people that are living in hotels to seek elsewhere to go. And that's the first thing that we have for reducing some of the crime at the hotels on Carowinds Boulevard.
So what's the length of time that you would estimate that you would be looking for?
We would think that the stay would not exceed 30 consecutive days, not with some of the hardships that we talked about. You just staying in a hotel room, not to exceed 30 days in the unincorporated areas, except in the circumstances we listed below, which we talked about. But you know, multiple 30-day periods with any consecutive 12-month period would not be allowed either. So you couldn't go to the Motel 6 for 30 days, leave for 3, come back for 30, and do that all year.
Could you go to another hotel though?
You technically could, but that,
There's no way to track it, is it?
well, but for the problem is, and what this is, they more than likely wouldn't do that. They would normally have to go somewhere else because they have everything they're doing this because they've been allowed to live in the hotel. They have burner plates. Now, one of the things that we've also started doing is getting fire marshals and those to start going up there with us, because a lot of these rooms are not zoned to have what looks like its own makeshift kitchen in the room, and that's what you have, burner plates, plug-in microwaves, and these things just in the room. So
Gotcha.
you're not gonna take all of that with you, sit somewhere for 3 days and then come back to it. What we're hoping is that this will cause that element to just move on, would be the desire.
Have y'all written out already sort of what y'all would like for that ordinance to look like?
Yes, yes, we have copies of it.
Okay. So are you seeing though, not only extended stays, but are you seeing large numbers of people staying in these rooms too?
Well-
Like over excessive?
Yes, and even the extended stays, but the one thing about the Carowinds Boulevard, the ones that are true extended hotels, the rates are a little higher. But even extended stay, you could still apply these to it with the exceptions still being in there.
Right.
If your house burned down, of course, you're gonna be in an extended stay longer anyway. And this is not, the purpose of this is not gonna apply to you anyway, because that's not your long-term goal to live in the hotel. Your house is being fixed. So even an extended stay would still be 30 days. If it turned into 6 months, it's only because you applied to one of the exceptions.
Right.
So that, the extended stay would be the same as the hotel.
And have you noticed this to be more prevalent in Carowinds, Rock Hill area, or all over?
It's primarily prevalent in your lower rate hotels.
Period.
That's it.
Period.
And when we've looked at Carowinds Boulevard, the two main problems up there for years were the Clarion and the Motel 6. But the Clarion is under complete renovation
Right.
and is in the process of transitioning to a Holiday Inn. And when he's finished, he anticipates his rates being 189 to 200. So
Yeah.
that will drive them out of the market of your living out of their car, long-term people.
Right.
And then the Motel 6 is, that's what drives it, is the lower rate. And then they can offer them some exceptional, long-term rate to live there essentially. So, so it's not necessarily a location, it's just the quality of the hotel and the element that they're bringing in there is what drives it.
So, one of the things I think what I see here is good, Tony. One of the things though, as a concern when we do this, I think it's critical that the other law enforcement agency, municipalities understand this change, because then we create more donut holes where we drive them to other areas, which I think if everybody's on the same page, then that's great.
But if you look at the proximity to where Carowinds Boulevard is and the other municipalities, Rock Hill already has similar things to this.
Okay.
And
Gotcha.
they're the only other municipality that would have the hotels that could do this anyway.
Right.
Fort
Right.
Mill, TDK, none of
Right.
these other places have these.
Right.
And what you would really think is that it would drive that Carowinds back into Charlotte
Right.
or out of York County,
Right.
because the only two places that have this quantity of hotels and quality of hotels are
Yeah.
us and City of Rock Hill.
Right.
They have ordinances, they're working on their part of it. They have an alliance with the hotels up there, which we're starting to try and form that with management.
Perfect.
We have notified each of the hotels what our intention is going forward with enforcement and things like that. This would be the first step in starting to remove some of that element that has led to the crime in the Carowinds Boulevard. And, when you have, just say for example, Carowinds now being Six Flags and opportunity for nicer hotels and things like that to come in, you have to try and get rid of a certain element to make that feasible. So,
No, I think that the concept of doing it is I 100% agree. I think it's great. I think that, again, my concern is that we drive them the right direction. And if the other municipalities are participating, then that's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Michael,
Sir,
before we pass this on to council, will we have to have legal look over any of it,
We'd
or?
like to look it over, absolutely.
Okay.
Appreciate copies being presented to you all. Happy to take a look at that.
I would
Okay.
think for this to be impactful, we need the hotels on board too, because they need to provide something to somebody that's gonna be there for the length of period of time that we have in here. Was it 30 days? Is that right? Or
Yeah.
6 months under certain circumstances? But they need to play a role in communicating this so that there's less issue for us on the back end from a legal perspective. It was communicated to them properly in the beginning, so if they broke the rule,
Oh, yeah, there would be no question that before, let's just say this became as is, and was gonna be effective
Mhm.
July 1st.
Mhm.
We would do incredible amounts of education and let the hotels know starting right now,
Mhm.
hey, this is coming July 1st. This is gonna be enforced. This is gonna be, we're not just handing it out, it's gonna be real. The fines are substantial. You have until then to get yourself within compliance. And most of them, knowing that, would start to do that.
Yeah.
You know, they would, because the owner's not gonna want $1,000 fine for each
Yeah.
violation they have.
Yeah.
So,
so do we have an accounting for all the hotels and motels in the county that fall into this category? Have we inventoried them?
the ones that are in the county that now, I'm sure you have some of these small hotels around York that could be in the same boat. Now, we wouldn't just target Carowinds Boulevard. If it was applied, it would be applied to everybody.
Everybody.
And we would go to every unincorporated hotel we have and explain it to them.
Right.
Because, you know, we know that we wouldn't want later on Carowinds to say, we know that there's a hotel on Congress Street now, or so-and-so.
Mhm.
So it would involve and include every hotel that's in the unincorporated areas in the county that we would teach, and we would still go by and enforce it. So it wouldn't be one of those things where this is just Carowinds Boulevard, it would be every hotel. But, you know, if you look at it, what's driving this necessity, even anything, is the crime on Carowinds Boulevard that's coming down from Charlotte and Transient and the hotels.
Right.
And with the concern for sex trafficking and the prostitution, and with Charlotte just enhancing their prostitution law in Charlotte, it's gonna drive a lot of that down here even more.
But but as of right now, on all these three issues right here, y'all have nothing in the books in your power to do any of this.
Not on length of stay,
No,
nothing.
With the hotel ordinance, we have nothing
Nothing.
at all.
Nothing. Okay.
We happen to rely on, county codes or,
Mhm.
fire marshal's office for those code
Gotcha.
violations, and then whatever state law allows us to do as far as criminal.
We're actually,
Yeah.
even, DHEC has came out with this, DHEC's gonna inspect the drainage areas and the waterways to see, because when you have something like this, you have to attack it from all. Law enforcement cannot be the sole entity, because there's ways around that, so you just can't. So it's really through enforcement, and, you know, we've talked about it, one of the strongest tools we have would be fire marshal and fire code, because that can get you shut down way sooner than anything else can, but it's also truly the most dangerous thing. Because you're still talking about sort of a time bomb thing when you have people
Right.
living in a standard hotel room with plug-in burner plates and microwaves that aren't designed and vented and those kind of things when people are living in hotel rooms.
Right.
Multiple extensions and plugs with not rated for what the code is,
Mhm.
and, you know, having improper, you know, utilities and those kind of things in the room. So
Mhm.
that, and we're starting to involve them in it as well, but this would be our piece that we could control and enforce,
Yeah.
and to start to minimize the long-term people living in hotels. So,
That's good. This is good.
Yeah.
This is good. Appreciate it.
So, real quick, Michael, on this thing, if we were to refer this though to council as of tonight, that would still give you time to do a legal review, right, prior to council?
It would, I don't have a copy of that, so I'd like to
Sure.
confirm.
I got it.
You know, I think there are hotels or motels in the county right now. I'm not gonna mention an area, just no reason to mention an area, but I think there are people that actually stay in the hotels permanently. So would a hotel have to change their status from a hotel to something else?
I mean, that's clearly something that's not even in my realm of what I would be even, you know, all we're talking about is reducing crime
Yeah.
and cutting down, whether it be a zoning issue, that would be the case. But if you look at it, it wouldn't be as simple as them just changing that, because look at what's different in the zoning for an apartment. And there's a lot of things that I'm sure are different that aren't just as simply saying, tomorrow you're an apartment.
I'm just wondering, thinking ahead, what else we might have to do to help enforce this, because people always look for loopholes.
Well, I mean, this right here is, you've been here longer than 30 days?
Yeah,
Do you fit under one of these categories? No?
yeah.
Here's your citation.
Yeah, I'm in favor of
Yeah.
this. I'm in
I
favor
think
of
Well,
this.
then,
Legal and
Can-
referring to the council.
can I have a motion to refer to council?
Yeah, do you want to refer these all together at once? or-
It don't matter, what y'all wanna do. Let's
I'll
refer them individually.
Okay,
We
I'll
might
do-
run into something that we have to,
Right.
I'll do a motion to refer the request for extended stays in hotels.
second,
Second.
I'll say in favor.
Aye.
Okay.
Motion approved.
And as y'all look at it, we would like that fine to be, where, that 1,000, because it doesn't do any good to walk up there and hand somebody a $200 ticket, because they're
Right.
like, we're making 12
There's
grand
no
on the
teeth.
room.
Yeah, there's no
Exactly.
teeth behind it.
So,
We're in agreement.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right,
Next one we wanted to talk about was the camping ordinance and some amendments to the camping ordinance.
Okay.
Basically,
Yeah,
what we're trying to do with the camping ordinance is have them provide some type of facilities, sewage, restroom facilities, water, because what we're running into is with the way it's written now, and people are allowing other people to camp on their property, they're staying there excessive amount of times, they don't have any type of sewage facility, bathroom facilities, water facilities. So what we're trying to do is have those added to the ordinance, to cover the.
simply just saying written permission isn't enough.
Yeah.
Because you're still having these large encampments that somebody could, you know, think about somebody living in, behind this building over here for 6 months with the feces, the bathroom, there's no proper, any of those facilities, no water, anything. And then what it does is if somebody owns property and is not here and just says, hey, yeah, you can stay there. Well, when they finally leave, what's on the property? Tons and tons and tons of trash.
That's right.
And, you know, you're also still talking about some environmental concerns when you have two people living in an area like that for months and months and months.
Agreed.
Mhm.
Y'all
Can I
have,
have a copy of it?
y'all have language of what
We
can
don't have
be-
language for that yet.
You
Okay.
know.
Still,
Yeah,
we're still working on,
Yeah, the-
working that one.
But
Okay.
with the camping we have, we just simply wanted to add to where you had to have adequate facilities to allow long-term camping. We're also not talking about your kids are having a sleepover and there's 3 tents in your
Right,
backyard.
right.
It's not what it is. Long-term
Hmm.
encampment and that type of camping.
How do you
Not just-
define an encampment or a long, like, is there a period or is there, how do you identify
I
it as
think
an encampment?
encampment, and there has to be some verbiage that would take it from 3 kids doing a sleepover in the
Right.
backyard or some Boy Scouts sleeping in the yard in tents
Right,
for a short period, a night or 2 in the weekend versus a long-term homeless encampment
Yeah,
is
you're
what
talking-
we're talking about,
3, 4, 5, 6 weeks
or longer.
or longer at a time with,
right.
4 or 5 people set up in some type of,
Yep.
This one's gonna be a little more complicated.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a
It
trick
will,
to
and that's
this
why
one.
we're working on, because we know that the vocabulary has to be exclusive to what we're looking for.
Right.
Okay.
But-
Because we're working on affordable, attainable workforce housing, that was
Right.
money in the budget for us to
Right.
start studying this.
Right,
And
so,
a piece of that could potentially, maybe be campers for people to live in, but going back to what you said earlier, I mean, I have an RV, and other people in this room have campers and RVs, and
I had one.
and you gotta be able to dump, if you're gonna move it and dump, or you gotta have a septic.
But if you,
You have to have a dump station, so,
if the county or anybody was gonna do affordable housing, they're gonna have the hookups, they're gonna have the power, they're gonna have the
Right.
water.
Right.
What kind of examples have y'all run up on and had trouble with that, Tony?
All right, so over near Ross and Walmart properties in Fort Mill,
Mhm.
yeah.
there was 2 encampments that almost close to half the size of this room of people that were living there on back-to-back encampments. And you're talking at least 3 or 4 old rusty grills that they had gone through, multiple canopy, those pop-up tents that were permanent with dishes, trash that they were just throwing over a hill and using the bathroom and throwing trash and food and everything, and think about what that draws and everything, and that's what we're talking about. And even though somebody might have said, yeah, you can stay there, that still shouldn't be enough to basically live like that
That's right.
outside. You
Yeah.
can't do that at your house. You can't build a house without sewer and water and the hookups and some of the code things there are. So
Yeah.
all we're trying to do is take camping from just simply permission, making it okay, to where there have to be other things in place to make it lawful to
Yeah.
stay there.
So let me ask you though, have you, in these situations, have you come across encampments where the people actually agreed to allow them to stay there?
We had one church that
Oh.
the impression was they were trying to get everybody to rehab.
Okay,
But then the problem is their church was in the county but surrounded by the city.
right.
So now the people that are living there are going through the yards and doing everything in other people's property.
Okay. Gotcha.
Then it became a matter to where now it's a nuisance.
Mhm.
So go to the church and they're like, all right, you can tell everybody to leave. Everybody that's gone to rehab is there. And then of course what happens is, hey, they left tons of trash down here.
Mhm.
Well, you let them live there,
Right.
Yeah,
you know, so
Yeah.
it's, and,
right.
and
right,
most
right,
people, and the problem is a lot of people want to try and do the right thing. There are people that, one, they believe some of the stories of the people, and most people want to be good people. People want to be good to each other. And you don't realize that if you got a small patch of woods and you you can stay back there because you're thinking all they're going to do is put a tent up and take all their trash and everything
Right,
else, and
right.
you're not going back there.
Right.
Well, 6 months later, you go back there and it looks like what you see
Right.
in a movie or something, and now you have tons of trash that you're responsible for.
Right.
So,
This is a major issue. I mean,
It
you
is.
talk to Burns, Ford, Cadillac, and they'll tell you how bad it is
Yeah.
on their property and around their property.
well, when the Normans went back behind the mall to look at, to expand some work, they had built almost a 2-story condominium of pallets on the property back there.
Wow.
I'm talking about square footage of this room, 2 stories high with multiple people living there, and truly acted like, this is our home.
Wow,
This is our property, you're here
right.
on, so it's,
So once you get, though, a property owner to say that I don't give them permission to be there, you can
oh, now we
clear,
can deal with it then. You have
clear it
littering.
immediately.
Yeah,
Right,
we have some resources there, even if it's,
Mhm.
even if you don't have trespassing, you have littering, you have a lot of those things there.
Mhm.
But,
Okay,
but even with the permission, and this would also apply to the owner. If you go back there and they've got a written letter from the owner, then the citation's to the homeowner
yeah,
or the landowner.
exactly.
See, here's what you have this encampment, here's your citation, you're in violation.
Look forward to more information on this one.
Yeah.
Well, do you, are y'all wanting to work some more on that?
Yeah, and the only reason is because the one thing that we know is that our verbiage has to prevent somebody from calling on you because you're having a sleepover and us looking at it like,
Yeah, that was
This is
what
camping.
was concerning.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we're gonna we'll explore encampment, we'll explore, you can use terms as homeless, the people that do not reside there.
Right.
There's terms that you can have exclusions to where we could get a call and say, somebody, he's got camping over here. No, ma'am, he's got his 2 kids having 2 tents out there doing a sleepover.
Right, right.
Because they reside there It's not long-term, it's not an encampment.
Mhm.
So you could have the verbiage will be what makes it solid, what we're looking for, and we will have that in what camping is, what the requirement is, and then what excludes that. This doesn't, the exceptions are kids camping in the backyard, family camps at authorized campgrounds. We would have all those exceptions in there. And they would prevent somebody from turning it into what you're talking about. This is geared strictly towards long-term homeless encampments.
Sheriff, you might wanna look at DHEC requirements too, because, you know, I camp over in Clemson and somebody will put their water out, the gray water out, and
Yeah,
even gray water.
and that's
Danger
why,
issue.
that's why if it's a long-term encampment and you require facilities, water, sewer, trash,
Yeah.
restrooms, they're in violation of that easy. There's the
Exactly.
camping
Mhm.
ordinance.
Yeah.
So even with the permission, you don't have water, you don't have sewer. And if the people are like, Mr. Johnson's letting me live here, Mr. Johnson, are you allowed to live there? Yeah, all right, well, here's your camping ordinance citation, you don't have water, you don't have sewer. What's he gonna say? Y'all gotta get out of here,
Right,
you know?
yeah.
So that's what the intent is, to not only protect the homeowner, but protect the county from these long-term, like you said, you have 2 to 6 people living in an encampment for 6 months. Just think about the DHEC
Contamination.
and the contamination, especially if they're near a water resource,
Right.
near a creek or whatever.
Well, let me
So-
ask you this question. You mentioned a minute ago that either Charlotte or Mecklenburg has imposed some new laws. Should we be looking at the same laws?
I mean,
If we're gonna, if people are gonna come here, because it's easier to get away with what they're
You know,
doing here
they're-
versus there.
I don't know, we'll have to look at the state prostitution and maybe look at a solicitation county ordinance that kind of covers that too, and that might be a thing to also go ahead and put as well, that will, because sometimes prostitution on the state level is hard to get, because you actually have to have the exchange of money, the contract, but solicitation is, you got 2 people pulling up at the park, and you know it's a lot easier on the solicitation aspect than it is prostitution.
Right.
So we may need to look at, and that's something we can work on next, is a solicitation, and we can
Yeah.
get something that aligns with that as well,
Okay.
to go ahead and prevent, because their prostitution just became some pretty stiff penalties up there. It's crazy to me what Charlotte wants to prosecute. They don't care if you break into everybody's car, but, you know,
Right.
doesn't make any sense.
All right, so you want us just then to defer this until further,
Yeah, so we just had the camping and the hotels for now.
The other one that was on there, on the
Derelict
agenda.
derelict structures.
Derelict structure.
Derelict structures.
The authority to address derelict structures.
What are we saying?
I tell you, abandoned houses, City of Rock Hill used to have a grant program, so you could access money to take down an abandoned house that's on your property.
And that's what we were talking about, because there's tons of places in the county where there's a trailer or something like that, or
Yeah.
Farlow Street's an example, and some of those where it's a completely dilapidated rental house, and it's there, and the owner is a property owner in California that has somebody managing it here.
Yep.
And it's just gonna stay that way, and people can sell drugs out of it, do drugs out of it, sleep in it, and all those things. And an ability to actually, you know, either acquire, destroy, or whatever to those derelict nuisance properties, once they've been deemed that now. And I guess what we would need is once we decided what it would take to deem it the nuisance, because there's also people that have land with something on it that's not applicable to this.
Yeah.
You know, you would have to have multiple occurrences, multiple reports, multiple offenses, and then it would be deemed a nuisance, to where then that, you know, the county could either seize or demolish the property.
Michael, is there anything already on the books on structures like that in the county?
Yeah, there's a nuisance provision, but what they want is to embolden it and add to it, I presume.
Do y'all have a copy of that ordinance?
The one that exists now is, the only, we have no enforcement, only, building and codes can enforce it, and actually
Right.
I think Jamie Cato is the only one that can deem something uninhabitable and condemn it
Well,
for the
this-
county as it stands now.
Yeah.
And that's for residential and commercial
Yeah, we've got,
abandoned issues. And there are some existing code, some zoning stuff that exists about boarding up doors and windows that the homeowner or the property owner is responsible for, but again, that's not anything that we can enforce.
right,
That's under, county codes.
And if it's us working with code enforcement, that's fine, but what we want is that, to be that good partnership where we're saying, look, this is not just a house
right.
that we gotta burn our saddle about. This thing is causing a ton of problem to where it gets here and then it's addressed.
It's almost as if we need a vacant property
It's like
policy.
like a nuisance, ordinance. I've kinda got one I'm working on that, entails more so than just abandoned properties, but places that have repeat calls for service for EMS, for
Right.
fire, for overdoses, for criminal, a
Mhm.
bunch of criminal activities that are repetitive over and over and over. And there's other counties in the state that
Yeah,
have,
it-
ordinances like
it-
that.
So some,
Example, is it 2145 Farlow? Is that the actual numbers? 2145, somewhere like that, isn't it? There's a Farlow, there's been homicides there, there's been all kinds of stuff, overdoses,
mhm.
and it's a rental property. And that's what we're talking about, something to where, you know, because I know Rock Hill has taken houses, seized them, bulldozed them, that rise to the level of that
Mhm.
type of nuisance. And so what we need is something that has teeth, that we have that partnership to start to get some of these high crime things, is what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
so
But you are working on.
I'm working on
something
one
else.
now
On the
that
language,
kind of
yeah.
encompasses all of these, the crime aspect of it, the,
Mhm.
derelict aspect of it, and just,
That's good.
Because the public
Yeah.
nuisance now just says it's unlawful for any owner, agent, occupant to maintain, use, or occupy any building, structure, manufactured housing, modular home, mobile home, abandoned swimming pool, water garden, ornamental pond, which is dangerous to life or limb, which could likely cause a fire, or which, because of its condition, use, or maintenance constitutes a nuisance, which because of the condition, walls, overloaded floors, defective construction, decay, or other, which might become breeding ground for vermin, mosquitoes. So some of these houses aren't to that. They're just that nuisance to where
Right,
there's multiple calls for services, overdoses, things like that, and it's a rental property. And the owner may be somebody that's not even here,
right,
and the guy's paying his rent on time,
Yeah.
and he doesn't care.
right.
So that's where we need to have the ability
Mhm.
to deem these things the public nuisance on the law enforcement aspect,
Mhm.
to where now because this is only something that you'd have to go in there and say the floor's bad, there's
Right,
a chance of mosquitoes, vermin, there's water issues. And some of these houses that we're talking about that are crime havens aren't gonna rise to this level. And there's nothing we can do with that because it's not
right.
to that. So
Okay.
we need something that would, like the
What
Farlow
if
Street.
we're tied to the number of calls to a property? So once it reaches, and there could be different categories, the third call, then
I don't know if
There's
I
some
would
kind of
necessarily
action.
want to tie it to the number of calls, but it may be the type of calls.
Yeah.
Well, the
the
type of
frequency
activities that have
calls.
been
The type,
identified.
consistency,
Right.
frequency,
Yeah.
and and you also still have the danger. You know, if you,
Yeah.
Oh,
if
yeah.
you,
Yeah,
if you're in a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, and there's overdoses and everything else,
right.
well, that's a major problem, because still people
Oh,
have
yeah.
kids around there.
So
So-
the type of calls that you're getting, or the yeah.
especially if an
So-
arrest is made.
We had a, home-
Yeah,
we,
that's
we had a,
the number of arrests.
yeah, we had
Well,
a abandoned
we're
house.
we're just trying to look at some of the ordinances that are
Mhm.
strictly zoning and code,
Mhm.
that don't allow us anything that can help and make it criminal. But we're also not trying to just overstep and be the police state, and we're only talking about places that are driving crime in an area.
Right.
That's what we're talking about.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
You won't be able to call them actual drug houses.
Right.
Yeah, exactly, right.
We can call them that, but until we can bulldoze it, it don't matter what.
Right, yeah, exactly. So more to come with both of these things?
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
all right.
But on both of those, we're also gonna be very cognizant of the fact that we're not trying to be the police and all that about how you live or anything like that. This is crime driven
Right.
and quality of life
Right.
for the people that surround it as much as the house. Because you have to start thinking about the people that live on Farlow Street and the streets around it more than the house that's there, because the more times you have a shooting at a house, eventually it's not just gonna stay in that house, it's gonna catch 2 kids next door.
I've gotten tons of calls on an abandoned house in my district that they just, you know, and it became a safety risk. So and it impacts the total community, right? So,
But some of those
I
aren't
had a
gonna,
call on one in York.
some of those aren't gonna rise to this level of derelict. This is somebody that's just let a house go to where it's so unsafe that kids playing in there might get hurt. We're not talking about that. Some of
Right.
these have floors, some of them have ceilings, some of them have water. They're not mosquito havens, but they're crime element places
well,
that we have got to get a hold of.
this one, it was abandoned and somebody got power into it and was basically running, you know, whatever they were doing. And since then, it's been taken care of, but, yeah.
David, do you have any experience with this?
On the derelict structure?
Derelict or any of the 3 topics we discussed?
Some, I've experienced it through the derelict portion as far as like CDBG and the blight, trying to address blight. I think what they're doing is a little bit different than blight, it's more for those nuisance properties.
That's right.
But, so I've researched it a little bit more. I think what they're getting after, which I actually really like, the defining what a nuisance actually is, the number of calls for service. If you talk about when we're getting to EMS calls and fire calls, some of those are more frequent, but they don't necessarily rise to the level of a nuisance, depending on what's happening.
Right.
But if you could tie it to something like the arrest or the types, you know, particularly violent crimes, things like that, I think that's a clear definition of what this group would probably consider a nuisance.
Yeah, and we're not talking, you know, down on Moore Drive, we call the EMS 220 times a month. We're not talking about that. We're talking about that are truly affecting the quality of
Yeah.
life to where
Yes.
you would be able to say, that house is a nuisance.
And
Right.
typically
Not because they're
rental
bothering people, they're a
houses,
nuisance, a
typically
dangerous.
rental houses.
Sometimes they're rentals, sometimes they're, you know,
The
single-
real-
single family owned,
The real
sometimes they're
problem is
generational type
are
houses,
passed
passed
down.
down, passed down, passed down.
That's the
That's the-
true problem houses, because a lot of times you can call the landlord and threaten them and tell them that, look, you're gonna lose your property. And a lot of times they'll evict somebody. It's the problems are grandma owned the house, gave it to dad, dad's a drug addict, kid's a drug dealer, dad dies, now kid owns a house, it's paid for. And that's the ones that are the problems, the real problems, because you have no recourse as a neighbor or anything. And that's the ones that that's the ones that we're really talking about are the true nuisances and what you would want to be able to deem that.
This is a crazy thought, but in other areas around the country, are they beginning to fine or bill a homeowner for you having to come out multiple times on the same issue, even if there's an arrest or 2? Is there a point where public service ends and there's a cost to the service?
I think that's what you would be doing with this versus, not to charge for calls for service. You would
Yeah.
just, you would have to, and we're talking about the rare house that it is a complete danger to everybody
Yeah.
there and start to have some teeth.
Yeah, so y'all figure that out and come back to us, and I
Yeah.
guarantee you this council will support you on that.
Yeah, and we just, you know,
There's
we're
gotta be a
looking,
model somewhere else. where
yeah, and
they
we're
do
looking at
this.
being very exclusive with it. It's not just,
I mean,
Sure.
The other thing that I like about what I have in my head is this could also be applicable to nuisance businesses. Like if you have a bar or a restaurant or something that has repeated alcohol violations, repeated drug issues, repeated
bar fights,
bar
assaults,
fights, assaults,
drug arrest in
drug
the bar.
deals, homicides. In my mind is how I'm picturing this being
Yeah.
applicable, not just residential, but also commercial,
right,
to maybe not bulldoze it, but to seize it or force them to shut
Put a
down.
lien on it,
whatever
whatever
you
it
Right,
is.
well, you'd
Public-
have more
the public
teeth in order
nuisance.
to
Yeah.
to get
Public
them.
nuisance
to do
is
what they
not
need to do.
residents alone. It is
Right.
a structure, business, house in the county that is a
Yeah.
public nuisance and being able to deem it so.
Yeah, there's examples around South Carolina, and there's also examples of how, you know, how lengthy of a process that can be. To Michael's point, we largely in our current ordinance address blight and those structures that are just dilapidated, but not nuisance. You know, I'm thinking off the top of my head, Greenville County, when they were shutting down one of their adult clubs there, that was a long process, and they really, I don't know if their ordinances necessarily addressed it, but it was a long process for them to get that shut down and moved out. So what we're really trying to do is avoid getting to that point where it's just a public outcry. So
Right.
it's,
And again, this would be utilizing these to the point where we seize them or demolish them as an exception and not.
Right, yeah, because they may turn things around, right? I mean, but if
Especially
you have
if
some
it's
teeth
landlord
behind it, they're not gonna turn
The
it
main
around
thing is to
if
go
there's no
to 'em.
teeth, right?
You have to understand something, you are right on the threshold of becoming this.
Right, exactly.
And
Yeah, yeah, you gotta have teeth.
that's the thing. And
Yep.
what we're just trying to do is just,
You're
It's all
gonna name
about-
it the straighten up law.
it's, well, I don't care what y'all name it, but,
the straight and narrow.
yeah. I
Straight
mean,
and narrow.
This, you can call it the this or this.
Yeah.
This, and then have a
Yeah.
picture of a bulldozer, I don't care what you call it, this or this. but-
Yeah.
And this is, like I said, every bit of this is just to protect the county, that's all it's for, it's not to,
So this is.
not to
this and
impose
that
our
law,
will.
This and that law.
right, this or that.
This or that law, there you go.
But,
Pretty good.
but
There
the
you go.
hotel one is gonna be a really big start.
The this and that.
The hotel ordinance will be a big start for,
Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
Okay, thank you.
So-
We'll take care of that. Y'all
Appreciate
get
it.
back with us on that.
yeah,
all right,
awesome. Thank y'all.
Thanks,
thank you
guys.
so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate everything y'all do here in the county.
Yeah, second.
All right, next item of business, the fire department issue related to the disbandment of the fire board.
All right, so I've printed off a handout, and it's more of a summary sheet. And what I hope to do tonight, we're not gonna make any recommendations. What I really wanna do is draw your attention to the needs and the gaps that are currently existing. You know, we're in year one of our 5 and 10 year plan with the fire and EMS. And, you know, one of the first things that is most important that we set up for success is our structure of governance and how the fire service is actually governed. So you can read this on your own, but I'll highlight a few things. On the second page, what I've done is done a comparison of the ordinances over the years. So there's a 1981, 1982, and then most recently a 2018 ordinance. And I just kind of describe some of the major changes, and you can read those. But currently, as it exists, you know, the governing body is largely county council. There's a fire advisory committee that advises on that. That is a 5-member committee, the fire service director and 4 chiefs. Those chiefs are actually appointed by the director. There's really no definition of term limits or not even necessarily statutory authority. County council, again, is the funding, administers the fire funding directly. The advisory committee, according to the ordinance, are kind of tasked with that policy and discussion of that funding, the levy. Again, council also mandates the basic policies and best practices for the departments. That's really vague and kind of ambiguous. Doesn't really cover what that entails. You know, the fire advisory committee actually does a lot with recommending policy, or I should say passing those policies as they relate, and that's as it should be, particularly as it relates to the operational aspect of the fire departments. But the best practices are, again, they're vague. I think they're largely or implied that it's related to funding, procurement, things like that, but it doesn't explicitly say so. Again, the operational control, again, that remains with the departments. The apparatus management, that is specifically mentioned how the county controls anything that's purchased by the county. And then there's also actually an enforcement tool in there, but again, the method or the manner in which the county would go through with this is not necessarily defined. You know, it references a county takeover. I believe that's happened in one case with a tax board that was disbanded because of issues, was reconstituted later. But again, you know, what rises to that level? So really what I want to do is as we complete the hiring process of the new fire service director, with that person coming in, setting that person up for success, and removing any ambiguity and actually giving some definition through the fire ordinance. Again, I don't want to make any recommendations tonight, but I want to communicate and express the need. So some of the gaps and issues that I've noted, and again, you can read these later, and I'll be happy to follow up with you more, but a clear scope and level of authority for the fire advisory committee. Should there be term limits? How and what process do those appointments go by? Again, it's very decentralized right now with one person. The director's, you know, operational authority in the county, what level should that be? And then also how the funding recommendations flow. Obviously, in the county, as we're very well aware, county management, as they just we just did, presented our executive budget. Now that's in council's hands, and so you'll start that approval process soon. This should flow similar to that. Again, that's not really defined very well, so we'd like to clear that up. The apparatus, again, that's functioning well. And then the hierarchy, how does that work with the fire advisory committee and the fire service director? I've run into situations in other counties where, if you're not serving, the difficulty of serving multiple masters, where you don't really know who you report to or who your stakeholders are. So I want to define that and set that up for success for the next services director. And then how that budget development should occur. So really what I'm hoping through this process, and I would like to be able to bring this back, but also have conversations with our fire services and the fire departments and the tax boards to bring you back recommendations. But number one is providing role clarity for the director and also for the fire advisory committee. What should their role really be? One of the things that is glaringly deficient right now is the policies and the policy manual of the fire service are largely antiquated. They don't match the 2018 ordinance. They make references to 1982 ordinances, so that's something internal that we need to update, but we need clarity from council in order to do that. I'll take an example is the funding equity. Right now, the former funding formula for the fire millage, the direct assistance is what we call it, it was statutory. With the passing of the 2018 ordinance, that was repealed. And now the statutory funding formula is just it's a carryover, but it's not defined. So council, what I would recommend is that we reconsider that. Should there be, I'm not again making any recommendations, but should it follow the same formula? Should it be performance-based? Should it be off of population, call volumes, full-time staff? What degree should we really be funding fire departments? As I presented during our budget discussions, we collect over $15 million countywide for fire services, tax district, county millage, and everything combined. But what you'll see is the distribution of that across the county is there's a big disparity with that. Some of that's created through tax boards and the rural fire millage is a tax district, although it's not a tax board, that would just be the county council. But so there's so much funding flowing around, but depending on where you're at, a statement was made recently that, when you cross an imaginary line, your level of service vastly changes. But you don't know that you've crossed that imaginary line. You're actually stealing that from one of our employees. And I thought that was a good point, that the level of service is not consistent across the county necessarily. And a lot of ways that we can correct that is through funding equity. The reorganization, when I say reorganization, I'm talking about the best practices of how we're actually recommending policies, budgets, funding recommendations, what the taxing authority should look like, how that's spread across the county. So that's what that's referring to. And then at the very bottom, just when I say why update the ordinance, the multiple taxing entities. We've got 8 districts, obviously 7 tax districts, but when I say 8 districts, there's also the rural fire millage, and that's considered a tax district. That was established in 1982. So we've technically got 8 taxing entities, each that has a board and ultimately reports to county council, but that's created, again, a disparity across the county that has really incentivized that level of service. If you're a more affluent section of the county, you can provide a higher level of service, but that really neglects the rural parts of the county. So we would like to create a funding equity and shore up that gap. But I just want to bring your attention to this, answer any questions that you may have, but I would really like to begin here when I say we're in year 1 of this 5-year plan. The centralized governance and unified governance of the fire service is where we start. And that's really what we're trying to get towards now. But that touches everything from policies, funding, to the actual decision policy setting group on behalf of the fire services.
But how would we go about that, since you do have the tax districts and then, the western side being that 8th? And there's so much difference there,
Right.
even between the tax districts.
So
How would you do that?
I don't have a specific recommendation for that. I'm not saying that we would want to necessarily dissolve any tax districts, but I do think the original purpose that the tax districts were set out for, a lot of them are approaching or at their millage caps. You know, they're to the point that where they're gonna have to consider referendums to increase their millage. So if that's on the table where they're gonna already have to start looking at millage increases, just to be able to continue to function at the level they're at, this isn't even adding any new
Yeah,
services.
and the annexation from the city, that's killing them.
It can have a major impact on them. That can drive down those revenues as well. Again, the level of service is not going down, but their funding may. So, you know, as we address this, we need to look at something that is going to create a countywide solution. And this is not a knock towards the tax districts. The tax districts are worried about their individual district and how can they properly function. That's good. We as the county have to worry about all of them. So we have to, when we talk about changes and anything that requires modification, we need to address it from a countywide level and not just picking out certain tax districts. We shouldn't pick out, I'm not picking on anyone, but we shouldn't pick out Flint Hill and say, because of the area that you're in, you're near, closer to Charlotte, you know, we're gonna focus there. What we should do is a countywide solution. So not making any recommendations, but that's what we're trying to work towards and propose to council is something that addresses this on a countywide level and creates a funding model that actually incentivizes the correct standard level of service across the whole county.
Right.
Yep.
So wouldn't you think in 10 years we'd have one countywide tax for fire and EMS?
I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, and I wouldn't say 10 years. I mean, that should be
I mean,
one of the
I'm
first
saying
things that
by 10
by 10 years,
we're gonna have-
absolutely.
Yeah,
You know, just the way that it's going, that's gonna become a necessity.
right.
I would really say that we should have an eye towards that sooner rather than later.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that the tax districts have done anything wrong, it's just their original purpose, they've reached the limits of it. So if we're already gonna have to change it, let's address it for the entire county and not just, you know, small areas.
Mhm.
I just don't know how we do it with the difference in the number of the people, the incomes.
Well, that's where the funding formula becomes important. And the one that we had previously was a fairly good formula, actually. I think it can get confusing because it requires constant recalculation every year. Something like that, but we also want to make sure that it's performance-based too, that we're incentivizing, you know, we're trying to create a high-performing organization at the county. We would want the fire service to be a high-performing fire service as well. So we want to incentivize performance.
So when we go through this process, so we've got rules clarity, we got funding equity, reorganization of multiple tax entities. So, from a dependency perspective, right? Do you feel it's better to approach it from a dependency perspective of let's approach this one first and we can address it? That's a main dependency and then we can move on to the next. Or are we gonna attack, you know, kind of do this all in one big bite? What would be your thoughts on how you would like to approach it?
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I believe role clarity is number one, so that we can
Mhm.
set up the director of the fire service for success. But
Okay,
at the same time, the funding piece it's already at our doorstep.
yep,
So those two are very important. I would say that a lot of this will really need to happen simultaneously. And this would be a first-year project. You know, I'd like to propose something to you later this year that actually addresses a lot of this.
yep,
But I think one without the other, if we make any amendments to an
100%.
ordinance, we're not really moving the needle forward as best as we can.
right, yeah, I just wanna make sure we get our dependencies stacked in
Agreed.
the right manner.
Agreed.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's all I got, that's good stuff, thank you.
Yeah,
Very good.
nothing for me.
What was that formula?
I'd have to go back and actually, I'll bore you if I read the whole thing,
Yeah,
Right.
don't bore me with it.
but it was, 60%, so if you take the entire county millage, and this is what it, so when I talk about the allocation, it's countywide of the rural fire unincorporated areas. 60% is distributed just on a base, everyone gets the same 60%. Then there's a 10% based on the number of residences, that would be rooftops. 10% based on the population, so the number of people living there, 10% based on the assessed value, and then another 10% based on the number of commercial buildings within the district. That's a pretty good start. I would say that that was fairly comprehensive, but again, that's a moving target. One of the things that that doesn't do is it doesn't, when we're talking about assessed property value doesn't necessarily equate into taxes. Because if you have an area that has a lot of commercial, or particularly a lot of projects that fall under a FILO, then they're not getting the same amount, because they're not contributing as much as their total assessed value into the pot of tax money. So they're actually getting less when they're having to provide more service there. So that's why this doesn't really necessarily capture a county-wide aspect of how funding should be distributed. But it's a great start, so I think that's our starting point. And frankly, that's how it's being distributed today. It's based on that formula.
You said base rooftops, assessed value, I'm missing two. What were the two?
Yeah, rooftops, population, assessed value, and then number of commercial buildings, so commercial rooftops.
Okay. Thank you.
And then the 60% is just that base funding.
Mhm.
So again, good start, but, and that's actually what we're still doing. For that to change, council actually has to take action to direct finance to change that allocation.
Right.
So it just stays the same without any, we have some individual agreements with municipalities that have superseded this. But again, that's also pulling from that entire pot of money.
Sure it is.
So we're a little bit behind the times, and we haven't necessarily addressed this since that 2018 ordinance.
Yeah, at least there's some starting point there.
Right,
you
it
know,
is. It
which
is.
is good. Cool. Sounds good. Excellent.
All right, so
Thank
I
you, sir.
guess
Appreciate it.
we'll hear more about this in the future then.
Yes, sir.
All right. All right, now our next item is the discussion regarding the board and commission's ordinance policy. This is the one me and Tom started. Michael?
Sure. There's been a request to evaluate how boards or members are appointed, when they're appointed, when their terms shall run. I believe there's been some question recently about appointive powers that aren't being exercised by council members in a timely fashion. And so the question is, how do you resolve that? And one option presented was to try to realign boards and commissions to have their appointment terms run consistent with the appointing council members' term in office. So you took office this past January, your boards for that particular district, Steve, would run 4 years as well from that date.
I had a question about that though. Because I got to thinking about, on those certain boards, you say like one would be like the tax district board. How would we make that fall in line?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to.
That's gonna be kind of confusing.
So I have a suggestion. What I've written down is have the right to continue with a current appointee or appoint a new person. So if a new council member comes on and they have their appointees, they can go interview the appointees that are there right now that the previous person had. If they like them, they can stay. If they want to replace them, they have the right to replace them. Then the second piece I wrote down was that maybe we consider a blackout period from July 1st until the person comes on board, that we don't appoint any new people in the 6 months leading up to new members coming on council.
Yeah.
So you kind of got two.
Yeah, I think the blackout piece.
I do like that idea.
Yeah, I do like that concept, but that's, to me, I mean, I guess we can settle on the time frame, right? But I think the blackout period, especially if you're up for election, I do agree with the blackout. I guess we just need to talk about what the time frame would be.
And then the second one was, just a new council member has the right to keep his or her appointee, so they can reappoint, if that's what they wanna do.
Yeah.
If they have somebody else that they've interviewed that has interest in serving on the board, and that more, you know, aligns with that individual, just let them appoint a new person. So it doesn't matter where they are in their term, they could appoint someone else.
Yeah. I'd have to, yeah, I hear what you're saying, I just gotta think about that one, yeah.
Apply it to
Mm-hmm.
the discussion that was had a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I gotta
I'm
think.
not saying that to be political, I'm
Yes.
just saying,
And
a council member might have to wait 3.5, 4 years to appoint someone that he or she feels like could do a really good job, due to
Right.
their experience, their
Right.
interest, their passion to serve on a board or commission.
Right, no, I get it, I guess that's something I would wanna think about that, so.
And the last piece of that is, we do have openings, a fair amount of openings on boards.
oh yeah,
You don't want the term to end with a council member, I don't think, because it's just more work to have to
Yeah,
appoint somebody else to the board.
right,
And there
Well,
could be
that
2
and-
terms served.
yeah.
and how would that fall with the in-between council?
Well, you have another challenge, under the option that I was discussing. You have 3-year terms and 4-year terms. So you would have to modify all existing 3-year terms if you could. We need to cross-check the statutes to make sure some aren't mandatory. You'd have to reconcile those to expand them to 4 years and then shift the term commencement to whatever that district. So you would have to I think we would have to realign every board and commission
Yeah, I think so.
to run from January or whatever the appointment period would be, if you're gonna have 4-year terms to run consistent with each council members.
I mean, that's doable, because, I mean, it is completely doable, it's a new direction, but I do like the concept of it. Because, you know, you could align it in that manner to have them end when that, and then if they're on again, they could reappoint them if they chose to, but if there's somebody else in there, they're automatically gonna have a new choice. Or-
Yes, you
Or
may-
they could choose to have that one
And
again.
you may wanna have some blackout period, because I think
Yeah, I think
rub
I like that
is-
period. Yeah,
November 7th,
Yeah.
November 8th, you start appointing people, if you just won an election,
yeah,
or lost an election, I should say.
yeah, lost election,
Um,
right.
So there's some, it's not an insurmountable task, but it
Right.
would take some time to realign
Yep.
the boards and have some process to make that change.
And I
Yeah,
think that
I think that's-
suggestion, or the one I mentioned, accomplishes the exact same thing.
It
It's just a
does.
different way to
Yeah.
approach it.
Yeah.
Same outcome.
It does.
No, this is a good discussion, I think this was, it's good. This is good.
Well,
Whether you want action to come out of committee, so we have something for
Yeah.
council to deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, do we, at this point right now, though, no, go ahead, I just gotta think about it for a second.
I like the idea of the blackout period.
Yeah,
Well, I'd suggest, I'd like to make a motion that we have a blackout period that starts July 1st through the end of the year. And then secondly, allowing any new council member the opportunity to continue with the appointment that's in the seat, or that they can reappoint, which is basically the same thing we're saying, it's just not as
Yeah.
difficult as redefining 3 or 4-year terms.
yeah, I'm good. So the more I think about it, I think, to me, I think that's maybe the easiest approach to driving the issue, as opposed to this, which I think is a good idea. So I'm gonna second that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna second
All in favor?
that. Aye.
Aye.
All right, yep.
All right. Do we got any executive session item?
Yeah, I got something I need to talk about in executive. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
None here.
Matters of concern.
Yeah, I think it's, no matters of concern here.
Okay.
Mhm.
Then
Motion
we're
to adjourn.
adjourned.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Karen,
There you go, man.
Michael, David, Carolyn.